There is a place in the world where stone meets sky, where the earth itself seems to have grown a spine, rising, falling, curling along the ridgelines of mountains that have stood since before the memory of men. Stand there in the golden hour, when the light drapes itself across 10,000 li of ancient grey brick, and you will feel something that is difficult to put into words. Not smallness, exactly. Something closer to humility. The quiet, overwhelming understanding that you are standing before a thing that should not exist. And yet, here it is. Here it has always been. This is the Great Wall of China. Not one wall, but many. Not one era, but dozens. Not the work of a single emperor's ambition, but the accumulated will of a civilization across nearly 2,000 years of history. To call it simply a wall is to call the ocean simply water. Technically correct, utterly insufficient. We tend to imagine it as it appears in photographs. That iconic ribbon of crenellated stone threading across the mountains north of Beijing, perfectly preserved, almost majestic in its solitude. But that image, beautiful as it is, captures only a fraction of the story. The Great Wall, in its full historical truth, stretches across deserts and river valleys, across frozen northern steppes and subtropical southern ridgelines. It was built from rammed earth and wood in some places, from granite and kiln-fired brick in others. In certain remote stretches, it has crumbled entirely back into the landscape from which it came, a ghost of itself, barely a shoulder-high mound in the dust. And in those humble ruins, perhaps more than anywhere else, the full weight of its history is felt most deeply. The story of the Great Wall begins, as so many great Chinese stories do, with a unification. In 221 BCE, a ruthless and visionary king named Ying Zheng conquered the last of the warring states and declared himself the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. He was 37 years old, and he intended to be remembered forever. He would be. Among his ambitions was the linking of existing defensive walls that had been raised by the northern kingdoms, barriers against the pastoral nomadic peoples of the steppe, particularly the Xiongnu, whose cavalry raids were a constant and devastating threat to the settled agricultural world of the Chinese heartland. The first emperor sent his greatest general, Meng Tian, north with an army, not just to fight, but to build. Estimates suggest somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million laborers were mobilized. Soldiers, convicts, peasant conscripts, slaves. They worked in conditions that were, by any measure, brutal. The wall, in Chinese historical tradition, is sometimes called the longest cemetery in the world. The bones of those who died in its construction are said to lie within it still. And yet, it rose. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Over the centuries that followed, successive dynasties would return to the wall, extending it, reinforcing it, abandoning it, rebuilding it. The Han dynasty pushed it further west, deep into Central Asia, protecting the nascent Silk Road. The Northern Wei, the Northern Qi, the Sui, each left their mark. But it was the Ming dynasty, beginning in the 14th century, who gave the wall the form we most recognize today, broad enough at the top for 5 horsemen to ride abreast, punctuated by watchtowers spaced so that no signal fire was ever out of sight of the next, surfaced in grey brick that has weathered 5 centuries and still stands. The planning alone was staggering in its complexity. Supply chains had to be organized across hundreds of miles of roadless wilderness. Kilns were constructed near the building sites. Archaeologists have found them, still intact, their bricks bearing the names of the craftsmen who fired them, stamped as a mark of quality control. Lime mortar, rice mortar, compacted earth. The engineering adapted itself to every landscape it encountered. In the mountains, walls followed ridgelines with almost geometric precision. In the desert reaches of Gansu, They were built from layers of reed and gravel and compressed sand, and remarkably, stretches of those earthen walls survive to this day. The wall was tested. In the 7th century, the Tang dynasty relied less on its stone than on diplomacy and military power, and the wall fell somewhat into disuse. In 1449, at the catastrophic Battle of Tumu, a Ming emperor was captured by Mongol forces, a humiliation that shocked the dynasty into a renewed commitment to its northern defenses. Watchtowers were rebuilt, garrisons reinforced. The signal fire system, capable of relaying a military alert from the far northern frontier to the capital in a matter of hours, was refined into something approaching a telegraph of smoke and flame. The wall held, not always, not perfectly, but it held. And then one day in 1644, it didn't. The Manchu forces that would establish the Qing dynasty did not breach the wall through force of arms. They walked through a gate, opened for them from the inside by a Ming general who had made his own calculations about the future. It was not armies that ended the wall's era of active defense. It was politics. It was betrayal. It was the oldest of human stories dressed in the armor of a new age. What remains today is something that has outlasted every empire that built it. It has witnessed invasions and migrations, famines and floods, the rise and fall of dynasties too numerous to count on one hand. It runs, in aggregate, for more than 13,000 miles, though the total, counting all periods of construction, may be closer to 40,000. In the segments that follow, we will slow down, as the wall itself invites us to do. We will walk each era of its construction with the care it deserves. We will meet the emperors who dreamed it, the generals who defended it, the workers who died building it, and the travelers who have stood upon it in every century since. We will follow the wall into the desert, into the mountains, into the places where it has gone quiet and returned to earth. There is no hurry. The wall has been waiting a very long time. It can wait a little longer. To understand the Great Wall, you must first understand the world that made it necessary. And to understand that world, you must go back, far back, to a China that did not yet know it was China. For nearly 3 centuries before the wall's first unified conception, the land we now call China was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, each with its own court, its own army, its own jealously guarded borders. Historians call this period the Warring States era, and the name requires no embellishment. It was exactly what it sounds like: a prolonged, grinding, often savage contest for dominance among 7 major powers: Qin, Chu, Yan, Zhao, Wei, Han, and Qi. These were not small skirmishes on forgotten fields. These were wars of annihilation, wars in which entire populations were enslaved or massacred, wars in which generals became legends and kings became cautionary tales. For 250 years, the fires of that contest burned without resolution. And then came Yingzheng, born in 259 BCE. The future first emperor came to the throne of the Qin state at the age of 13, following the death of his father. Qin was already the most powerful of the warring states, ruthlessly legalist in its philosophy of governance, militarily innovative, economically disciplined. But Yingzheng was something beyond even what Qin had produced before. He was possessed of an ambition so total, so consuming, that it functioned less like a personality trait and more like a natural force. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he had done what no one before him had managed. He had conquered them all. One by one, the other 6 kingdoms fell, some in years, some in months, until, in 221 BCE, Yingzheng stood over a unified Chinese world and decided that the old title of king was simply no longer adequate. He invented a new one, Huangdi, emperor, and he appended Qinshi, first of Qin, to announce that he intended this to be the beginning of a dynasty that would last 10,000 generations. It would last 15 years. But that is another story. What concerns us here is what the first emperor looked at when he turned his gaze northward, beyond the borders of his newly unified realm. What he saw was not simply open land. What he saw was the steppe, that vast wind-scoured grassland extending from Manchuria to Central Asia, a world that operated by entirely different rules than the one he had just conquered. The people of the steppe did not farm. They did not build cities or maintain bureaucracies. They moved, season by season, following their herds across a landscape that rewarded mobility and punished permanence. And they rode. They rode with extraordinary skill from childhood, and they fought on horseback with a fluency that the settled armies of the Chinese states had spent generations trying, often unsuccessfully, to match. The dominant force on the steppe in this period was a confederation of nomadic peoples known to the Chinese as the Xiongnu. They were not a single ethnicity or a single tribe, but a political entity of remarkable organizational sophistication, a kind of empire of the grasslands, held together by a supreme leader called the Chanyu, and governed through a hierarchy of subordinate kings and chieftains. Their raids into the northern Chinese territories were not random acts of banditry. They were systematic, seasonal, and deeply destructive, striking into farmlands to take grain, livestock, and people, and retreating northward before a conventional Chinese army could effectively respond. The steppe was their advantage. Against cavalry that could evaporate into 1,000 miles of open grassland, walls and fortresses meant comparatively little. Speed was their shield. But walls, the first emperor understood, served a purpose beyond simply stopping an enemy in their tracks. They controlled movement. They defined where an army could cross and where it could not. They created choke points, and at choke points defenders have the advantage. Now, the walls already existed. In fragments, the northern kingdoms of Yan, Zhao, and Qin had each independently constructed defensive earthworks along their northern frontiers in the preceding centuries, pragmatic responses to the same nomadic threat. They were not unified, not continuous, often not even particularly well maintained. But they were there, and the first emperor, with the newly mobilized resources of a unified empire at his disposal, saw in them the skeleton of something grander. In approximately 215 BCE, he dispatched his most trusted general, Meng Tian, northward with an army of 300,000 soldiers, and orders not merely to push the Xiongnu back, but to build, to connect, extend, and reinforce the existing walls into a single continuous barrier along the northern frontier. It was, in the context of the ancient world, one of the most audacious infrastructure projects ever conceived. The scale of what was being attempted had no real precedent. The Roman Empire would not reach its greatest extent for another 2 centuries. The pyramids of Egypt, already ancient by Meng Tian's time, had been built over decades by a concentrated workforce in a relatively small geographic area. What the first emperor was proposing was something fundamentally different, a construction project stretched across thousands of miles of some of the most inhospitable terrain on the continent, from the marshes of Liaodong in the east to the desert corridors of what is now Gansu province in the west. The logistics of this undertaking were, by any reasonable estimation, staggering. Consider the problem of materials alone. In the mountainous regions of what is now northern Hebei and Shanxi, stone was abundant, and the early Qin War made extensive use of it. Granite and limestone quarried from nearby hillsides and hauled by human labor to the construction sites. But the wall did not stay in the mountains. It moved through river valleys and across open plains, and there, stone was not always available. In those regions, workers fell back on the most ancient of Chinese building traditions, hangtu or rammed earth. Layers of loose earth and gravel were poured into wooden frames and compacted with heavy pestles, layer by patient layer, until a wall section of surprising solidity emerged. In the far western deserts, where even timber for frames was scarce, workers incorporated local reeds and tamarisk branches into the earthen mixture, creating a kind of natural reinforced composite that, in the extraordinary aridity of the Gobi, has proved durable enough to survive to this day. Travelers in remote Gansu can still see these walls, low and wind-worn, the color of the desert itself easily mistaken for a natural ridge, unless you know what you are looking at. But they are not natural. They are human. They are Qin. Water, too, had to be managed. Garrison troops along the wall needed to drink. Supply chains, carrying grain and equipment from the settled heartland to the frontier, had to be organized across distances that would challenge a modern logistics operation, let alone one operating in the 3rd century BCE. Roads were built parallel to the wall for this purpose. Secondary walls and earthworks were constructed to protect the supply roads themselves. The Great Wall, in other words, was not simply a wall. It was a system, a military infrastructure network of extraordinary complexity, designed not just to stop the enemy, but to sustain the men who were stopping them. And then there were those men, the builders, the laborers. They came from every corner of the empire and from nearly every stratum of Chinese society, though the middle and upper strata were largely exempt from the heaviest work. Soldiers garrisoned the frontier and contributed to construction. Convicted criminals were sentenced to wall labor as punishment, a common fate for the minor and major infractions alike under the rigid Qin legal code. Peasant conscripts were levied from villages across the empire, torn from their farms and families for months or years at a time, transported north to work on a project whose full scope they likely could not have imagined when they arrived. Conditions were harsh in ways that even the historical record, which does not always concern itself with the suffering of common people, cannot entirely conceal. The work was backbreaking. The northern winters were savage. Food supplies were chronically insufficient. Disease moved through labor camps with the efficiency of a second army. The historical texts speak matter-of-factly of mass death during the construction years, and Chinese folklore preserved this grief in ways that official records did not. The most famous of these folk traditions is the legend of Meng Zhengnu, a young woman whose husband was conscripted and sent to the wall, who traveled thousands of miles to bring him winter clothing, only to learn upon her arrival that he had died and been buried within the wall itself. Her weeping, the legend says, was so profound and so inconsolable that the wall cracked open before her grief, revealing his bones. She gave him a proper burial, and then she threw herself into the sea. It is, like all great legends, not literally true, but it carries a truth of a different kind. The truth of what the wall cost, measured not in bricks or miles or imperial ambitions, but in the weight of ordinary human lives, in the grief of wives and mothers and children who waited for men who did not come home. The first emperor never saw the finished wall. He died in 210 BCE, while on one of his famous inspection tours of the empire. Perhaps fittingly, given that he spent much of his reign in restless movement, unable or unwilling to remain still in one place. He died convinced, apparently, that his dynasty would indeed last 10,000 generations. Within 4 years of his death, the empire he had built was in open rebellion. Within 15, the Qin dynasty was gone, but the wall remained, imperfect, incomplete in places, already crumbling in others, but there, a line drawn in stone and earth across the forehead of the continent, asserting, in a language that required no translation, that here there was a border, that here the world of cities and harvests and emperors ended, and the world of the open sky and the wandering people began. The Qin Wall was a beginning, and like all beginnings, it contained within it the outline of everything that would follow. Empires, like rivers, rarely follow straight lines. They bend around obstacles, accelerate through narrow passages, and sometimes, in their quieter stretches, appear almost still, even when the current beneath the surface is moving faster than ever. The Han Dynasty, which rose from the ruins of the Qin in 26 BCE and endured for 4 remarkable centuries, was very much a river of this kind. On the surface, in its early decades, it appeared to have stepped back from the wall, to have retreated, in a sense, from the grand ambitions of the first emperor. Beneath that surface, however, it was gathering itself for something even more extraordinary. To understand what the Han did with the wall, you must first understand what the Han inherited from the world that preceded them. The collapse of the Qin dynasty had not simply created a political vacuum, it had created a military one. The vast conscript armies that Qin Shi Huang had maintained along the northern frontier, the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who garrisoned the wall and kept the Xiongnu at a cautious distance, had been dissolved in the chaos of rebellion and civil war. The wall itself, never truly finished in the Qin conception of it, had been left without the manpower to maintain or defend it. And the Xiongnu, watching all of this from their side of the frontier with the patient intelligence of people who understood perfectly well how power worked, had wasted no time. Under their most capable and visionary Chen Yu, a leader named Modu, who had, in a story worthy of its own documentary, murdered his own father to claim leadership of the Confederation. The Xiongnu expanded aggressively southward, reclaiming territory that Meng Tian had pushed them out of, and then pushing further still. By the time the first Han Emperor, Gaozu, had consolidated his control over China and turned his attention northward, the Xiongnu were not simply a raiding nuisance. They were a rival empire, arguably as powerful as the Han itself, and they knew it. Gaozu made a decision that history has recorded with a mixture of pragmatism and embarrassment. In 200 BCE, he led an army northward to confront Madu directly. It did not go well. The Han forces were surrounded at a place called Baideng, trapped on a plateau for 7 days, cut off from their supply lines, facing a Xiongnu cavalry force that the Han simply could not match on open ground. Gaozu escaped, ultimately, through negotiation rather than military force. And the negotiation that followed, a policy known as Hikin, or peace through kinship, established a pattern that would define the early Han relationship with the steppe for decades. Chinese princesses were sent north as brides for the Chanyu. Silk, grain, and other goods were sent as tribute. In return, the Xiongnu agreed, more or less, to observe the frontier. It was a humiliation dressed as diplomacy, and the Han court knew it. For 3 generations, this arrangement held uneasily, incompletely, punctuated by raids that the Xiongnu seemed to regard as entirely compatible with the peace agreement. And then came the emperor who would change everything, the emperor who would not merely defend the wall, but use it as a launching point for something far more aggressive. His name was Liu Che. History knows him as Emperor Wu Wudi, the martial emperor. He came to power in 141 BCE at the age of 15 and ruled for 54 years, making him one of the longest reigning emperors in Chinese history. He was brilliant, temperamental, extravagant, occasionally cruel, and possessed of a strategic imagination that genuinely reshaped the geography of the known world. He looked at the Hikin policy that his predecessors had maintained and saw it for what it was, not stability, but stagnation, not peace, but a slow hemorrhage of Chinese prestige and resources northward into the steppe. He ended it. What Wudi launched against the Xiongnu was not a defensive campaign. It was an offensive one, sustained, systematic, and prosecuted over decades with a relentlessness that eventually broke the Xiongnu Confederation as a unified political force. His generals, most famously Wei Qing and the remarkable Wu Gubing, A young man of such military genius that he was leading major cavalry campaigns before the age of 20, drove the Xiongnu northward and westward, out of the Ordos region, out of the Hexi corridor, back into the deep steppe where Han armies followed them with uncomfortable persistence. And as the armies advanced, the wall followed. This is the moment in the wall's history that most people overlook, because the mental image of the wall is so firmly attached to mountains in the north. But under the Han, the wall moved west, dramatically, ambitiously west, into landscapes that could not have been more different from the forested ridgelines of the Qin construction. The Hexi corridor is a narrow strip of relatively habitable land threading between the Tibetan Plateau to the south and the Gobi Desert to the north, connecting the Chinese heartland to the vast open spaces of Central Asia. It is arid, wind-swept, and in winter, savagely cold. It is also, as Woody recognized with strategic clarity, the single most important geographic passage in the region, the gateway through which the Silk Road would eventually flow, and through which, if left unguarded, the Xiongnu could sweep southward at will. The Han wall in the Hexi corridor was, by necessity, a different creature from the mountain walls of the Qin. Stone was scarce. Timber was scarce. What was not scarce was earth, gravel, and the remarkable desert plant known as tamarisk, a shrubby, salt-tolerant species with long, pliable branches that, when layered with gravel and compressed earth, created a building material of unexpected durability. Han engineers developed techniques specific to this landscape, constructing walls from alternating horizontal layers of tamarisk branches and compacted gravel that bonded together over time into a substance almost as hard as adobe. In the extraordinary dryness of the Gobi, these walls did not rot. They calcified. Sections of Han wall in the Hexi corridor, 2,000 years old, still stand to a height of several feet, their layered construction visible in cross-section where erosion has cut through them, like a geological stratum made by human hands. Beyond the walls themselves, the Han built something that the Qin construction had only partially conceived, a fully integrated frontier system. Watchtowers, feng shui towers, were erected at regular intervals along the wall's length, each within signaling distance of the next. A sophisticated communication protocol governed their use. A single beacon fire meant enemy forces spotted. 2 fires meant a force of 500 or more. 3 fires, 1,000. 4 fires, the highest alert, meant an army. This system could carry a military warning from the far western reaches of the Hexi corridor to the capital at Chang'an in a matter of hours, a speed of communication that would not be meaningfully exceeded for another 15 centuries. Alongside the watchtowers, the Han established a network of garrison communities, not simply military outposts but proto-settlements, places where soldiers lived for years at a time, farming the land around the wall to supplement their rations, raising families, and gradually transforming the frontier from a purely military zone into something more complex and more permanent. Thousands of documents recovered in the 20th century from the ruins of Han watchtowers, written on wooden strips preserved by the desert's dryness, give us an extraordinary window into the daily lives of these frontier garrisons. We read their supply requisitions and their duty rosters. We read their complaints about inadequate winter clothing and delayed grain shipments. We read, in one touching document, a soldier's request for permission to leave his post briefly to attend to a sick relative. The bureaucratic machinery of the Han state followed its soldiers all the way to the edge of the known world, and the paper trail it left behind is, 2,000 years later, still being read. The wall also served, increasingly, as the spine of the Silk Road, that great network of overland trade routes connecting China to Central Asia, Persia, the Mediterranean world, and eventually Rome. The Han garrison system protected the caravans. The watchtowers monitored movement across the frontier, The rest stops and supply depots built to service the military simultaneously service the merchants. In this way, the wall transformed from a purely defensive structure into something more dynamic, a piece of infrastructure that made long-distance trade not merely possible but sustainable, threading commerce and diplomacy through landscapes that would otherwise have been too dangerous and too remote to cross. By the time the Han Dynasty began its slow decline in the 2nd century CE, the wall stretched from Liaodong in the northeast to Dunhuang in the far west, a distance of extraordinary magnitude representing the work of generations of laborers, engineers, soldiers, and administrators. It had helped break the Xiongnu as a continental power. It had protected the arteries of the Silk Road. It had defined, for the first time in history, something resembling a fixed intentional boundary between the Chinese world and the world beyond it. But boundaries, however carefully built, are only as permanent as the power that maintains them. The Han Dynasty eventually exhausted itself, drained by the very military campaigns that had made it great, fractured by court intrigue and regional rebellion, worn down by the cycles that seemed to govern all great empires regardless of their genius or their ambition. When the Han fell, the wall fell with it, not in any single dramatic moment, but gradually, garrison by garrison, tower by tower, as the men and the money that maintained it were drawn away by more immediate crises closer to home. And then the steppe moved south again, as it always did, as it always would. The wall would wait, patient as stone, patient as compressed earth and tamarisk root, waiting for the dynasty that would come back to it. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over abandoned things, not the silence of emptiness exactly, but something more layered. The silence of a place that was once full of noise and purpose and human urgency, and has since been returned, gradually and without ceremony, to the keeping of wind and grass and time. Walk the stretches of wall that were built during the Han and left untended through the centuries that followed, and you will hear that silence. It is not unpleasant, but it is not nothing either. It carries weight. It carries the memory of 10,000 men who once stood where you are standing, scanning the northern horizon for the dust cloud that meant riders were coming. For nearly 1,000 years after the collapse of the Han Dynasty, the Great Wall existed in a state that can only be described as purposeful neglect. Not forgotten entirely. It was too large, too present in the landscape and in the cultural memory of the Chinese people to ever be entirely forgotten. But neither was it maintained, extended, or seriously garrisoned in the way its builders had intended. It became, in those long centuries, something between a ruin and a symbol, a monument to a unified China that no longer existed, standing sentinel over a frontier that no longer held. To understand why, you have to understand what China became in the centuries following the Han. The collapse of the Han Dynasty in 2000 TCE did not produce a clean succession of power, as collapses sometimes do. It produced fragmentation, a splintering of the unified Chinese world into competing regional kingdoms that would persist in various configurations for nearly 400 years. Historians of China refer to this era as the period of disunion, and again, the name is entirely literal. The Three Kingdoms period, the Jin dynasty's partial reunification and subsequent collapse, the 16 Kingdoms period in the north, the southern and northern dynasties. These labels, following one upon another in the historical record, can feel almost numbing in their succession. But behind each label is a human reality of extraordinary turbulence. Wars that consumed entire generations, famines that depopulated whole regions, migrations of hundreds of thousands of people fleeing violence and instability. A civilization that had, at its Han peak, represented perhaps a third of the entire world's population, tearing itself apart across centuries of conflict that left almost no corner of the Chinese world untouched. In this context, the wall was simply irrelevant. Or rather, it was relevant in a way its builders had never intended. The threats to Chinese civilization in the period of disunion did not come exclusively from north of the wall. They came from within. Rival Chinese kingdoms fought each other with a ferocity that made the Xiongnu raids of the Han era look almost manageable by comparison, and the nomadic peoples of the steppe, far from being held at a respectful distance by a functioning frontier system, became active participants in the political chaos of the Chinese interior, invited in as allies by one faction, hired as mercenaries by another, eventually carving out kingdoms of their own in the northern Chinese heartland. This is one of the great and underappreciated ironies of the wall's history. The structure that had been conceived specifically to keep the steppe world out of the settled Chinese world proved, during these centuries, to be entirely beside the point. The boundary it represented, between nomadic north and agricultural south, between the rider's world and the farmer's world, turned out to be far more permeable than any wall could address. People crossed it in both directions constantly, not always through violence. Trade crossed it. Ideas crossed it. Bloodlines crossed it. Several of the dynasties that ruled northern China during the period of disunion were founded by leaders of steppe origin who had adopted Chinese administrative practices and cultural forms while retaining their own traditions, a blending, a hybridization, that the wall had been designed to prevent, but that proved, in the end, to be one of the most creatively fertile processes in Chinese history. The wall watched all of this from its ridgelines and its desert corridors, crumbling a little more with each passing decade, its watchtowers going dark one by one as the garrisons were withdrawn or simply stopped being replaced. The Sui dynasty, which briefly reunified China in 501 CE under Emperor Wen and his son Emperor Yang, made one of the last major pre-Ming investments in wall construction and repair. But even this was as much a gesture of imperial symbolism as it was a serious military undertaking. Emperor Yang, in particular, was a ruler whose ambitions consistently outstripped his practical judgment. He launched 3 catastrophic military campaigns against the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo, each one a disaster of logistics and overreach that drained the dynasty's treasury and its popular goodwill simultaneously. He also ordered substantial wall construction in the north, reportedly mobilizing over 1 million laborers for a single campaign of building in 607 CE, a figure so large that historians still debate its accuracy, though there is little doubt that the scale was immense and the human cost severe. The Sui wall was built in desperate haste, and much of it showed it. Within a generation, the Sui dynasty had collapsed under the weight of its own excesses, and China passed into the hands of the Tang. And here the story of the wall takes its most interesting turn during these dark centuries, because the Tang dynasty, arguably the most cosmopolitan, culturally brilliant, and militarily self-confident dynasty in Chinese history, looked at the wall and made a conscious, considered decision to largely ignore it. The Tang emperors did not need the wall, and they knew it. They had something better. They had, in the early dynasty especially, a military of extraordinary effectiveness built around a core of cavalry that could meet the steppe peoples on their own terms, fast, mobile, capable of projecting force deep into nomadic territory rather than simply reacting to raids at a fixed defensive line. The great Tang military campaigns of the 7th century pushed Chinese influence further into Central Asia than it had ever reached before or has ever reached since, defeating the eastern and western Turkic Khaganates, establishing protectorates across what are now Xinjiang, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. Tang armies fought and won battles at distances from the Chinese heartland that would have been unthinkable to Qin Shi Huang. For a dynasty capable of this kind of projection, a fixed defensive wall was almost philosophically contrary to its military doctrine. You do not need a wall when your cavalry is already 500 miles beyond it. And so the Tang maintained the wall only minimally, focused their energy and resources on the mobile armies and the diplomatic networks that were the true instruments of Tang power, and built instead a reputation for openness and cultural exchange that drew merchants, scholars, missionaries, and artists from across the known world to their capital at Chang'an, a city of perhaps 1 million people, the largest on earth at that time, buzzing with the languages of Persia and Arabia and India and Central Asia. Its market stacked with goods from every corner of the Silk Road network. It was magnificent. And, like all magnificent things built on assumptions that eventually prove incorrect, it was fragile. The Tang dynasty's military confidence was dealt a decisive and irreversible blow in 751 CE at the Battle of Talas River, fought in what is now Kyrgyzstan against an expanding Abbasid Caliphate and its Turkic allies. The Tang forces were routed. Chinese westward expansion stopped permanently at that line. And then, 4 years later, a greater catastrophe. A military governor of mixed Sogdian and Turkic ancestry named An Lushan, a man who had risen to enormous power and favor within the Tang court, launched a rebellion that came within a breath of destroying the dynasty entirely. The An Lushan rebellion, which lasted from 755 to 763 CE, killed, by some estimates, anywhere between 13 and 36 million people through direct violence, famine, and displacement. It is one of the deadliest events in human history by any measure, and it left the Tang dynasty a diminished and permanently weakened version of itself, dependent on the very regional military governors whose independence would eventually bring it down. The wall, through all of this, endured in the way that only things without ambition can endure. It had no stake in the outcome of these dynastic struggles. It did not care about the Battle of Talas, or the An Lushan rebellion, or the slow dissolution of Tang power in the 9th century. It simply stood, or in many places, slowly ceased to stand, doing what ruins do, which is to absorb time and weather and silence and hold them, the way stone holds warmth after the sun has gone down. After the Tang came the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, another half-century of fragmentation, and then the Song dynasty, which reunified much of China in 960 CE, but never managed to reclaim the northern territories, and spent much of its existence under existential pressure from northern powers. First the Khitan Liao, then the Jurchen Jin, and finally, most devastatingly of all, the Mongols. The Song dynasty chose diplomacy and tribute over military confrontation, and when those failed, it retreated southward, sustaining itself in the fertile lower Yangtze region for another century and a half before the inevitable arrived. The inevitable, in this case, wore the face of Genghis Khan. And no wall, not the Qin wall, not the Han wall, not any of the fragmentary constructions that had been raised and repaired and abandoned across 1,000 years of Chinese history, was going to stop what was coming from the north. The Mongols did not break the wall. They barely noticed it. They swept through it, around it, over it, with the casual thoroughness of a tide coming in, and beneath their horses' hooves, the Middle Kingdom shuddered, and then went very, very quiet. The wall waited, as it always had, but this time, when the dust finally settled, something new was stirring, something that had learned from the Mongols themselves what total military dominance looked like, and had decided, with a cold and clear-eyed determination, that it would never again be on the receiving end of it. That something was the Ming dynasty, and the Ming were about to build a wall that the world would never forget. There are moments in history when a civilization looks into the abyss of what nearly destroyed it, and rather than turning away, chooses to stare back. To study the abyss, to understand its dimensions and its depth and its particular qualities of darkness, and then to build, with extraordinary deliberateness, something designed to ensure that the abyss never gets that close again. The founding of the Ming dynasty in 1368 was one of those moments. To appreciate what the Ming built, and why they built it with the intensity and the obsession that they did, you have to sit for a moment with what China had endured under Mongol rule. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan in 1271, following his grandfather Genghis's initial conquests, had governed China for nearly a century. It was not, by every measure, a purely catastrophic period. Trade flourished along the Mongol-secured Silk Road in ways that connected China to the wider world more thoroughly than ever before. Cultural exchange, artistic, scientific, philosophical, moved freely across the enormous Pax Mongolica. Marco Polo, if his account is to be believed, walked the streets of Kublai's capital and was dazzled by what he found there. But for the Chinese people, particularly the Han Chinese who formed the majority of the population, Yuan rule carried the persistent, grinding indignity of being governed as a subject people in their own land. The Mongols maintained a strict social hierarchy that placed Mongols at the top, then various Central Asian and Western peoples who served the Yuan administration, then Northern Chinese, and finally, at the bottom, the Han Chinese of the South, the most numerous, the most productive, and the most politically marginalized. Government positions of real authority were largely closed to Han Chinese. Military power was concentrated in Mongol hands. The elaborate examination system through which educated Chinese had traditionally entered government service was suspended for long stretches of Yuan rule, cutting off the path of advancement that had defined Chinese elite society for centuries. By the mid-14th century, the Yuan dynasty was consuming itself, weakened by succession disputes, devastated by the Black Death, which moved along the Silk Road with the same efficiency as the silk itself, and facing a wave of popular rebellions across the Chinese countryside that the increasingly dysfunctional Yuan military could not suppress. Out of those rebellions, one man emerged. Zhu Yuanzhang was, by any measure, one of the most improbable founders of a dynasty in world history. He was born into absolute poverty in 1328, orphaned as a young man when famine killed his family, spent time as a wandering Buddhist monk begging for food, and eventually joined a rebel army almost by accident. What he lacked in background and education he compensated for with an iron will, a ferocious tactical intelligence, and a gift for inspiring loyalty that proved, over 2 decades of warfare, to be more valuable than any noble lineage. By 1368, he had driven the last Yuan emperor north beyond the wall and declared the establishment of a new dynasty. He chose the name Ming, meaning brightness or brilliance. He was not a man given to understatement. The Hongwu emperor, as Zhu Yuanzhang is known by his reign name, was in many ways shaped entirely by his terror of what he had overthrown. He had seen what nomadic conquest looked like from the ground level, from the very bottom of the social order, and it had marked him permanently. His entire domestic policy was organized around stability, self-sufficiency, and the prevention of any external threat gaining the foothold that the Mongols had gained. He was suspicious of merchants, suspicious of foreign influence, suspicious of anything that reminded him of the open, porous, cosmopolitan world that the Mongols had operated within and exploited. He wanted China closed, consolidated, and defended. The wall, in this context, was not simply a military project. It was a philosophical statement, a declaration written in stone and brick across the entire northern frontier of where China ended and the outside world began. But it was the third Ming emperor, the Yongle emperor, who seized power from his nephew in a bloody civil war in 1402 and moved the capital north from Nanjing to Beijing, who truly set the wall's reinvention in motion by placing the imperial heartland within striking distance of the northern frontier. Beijing sat just south of the mountains through which any serious northern invasion would have to pass. It was, strategically speaking, a bold and somewhat alarming choice of capital, putting the emperor himself in the most exposed position imaginable. What it meant, in practical terms, was that the defense of the northern passes became a matter of immediate, personal, existential importance to the Ming court, in a way it had never quite been when the capital was safely ensconced in the south. The wall had to be built, properly built, permanently built. The construction that followed over the next 2 centuries was unlike anything that had come before it in the wall's long history. The Qin and Han walls had been impressive achievements, but they were primarily earthen, rammed earth and compressed gravel and tamarisk root, durable in dry climates, but vulnerable to rain, frost, and the patient erosion of wetter northern landscapes. The Ming engineers looked at those ancient walls and understood that if they were going to build something that would genuinely last, they needed a different material. They chose fired brick. The decision to build in kiln-fired brick transformed the wall from a military earthwork into something closer to monumental architecture. Brick could be manufactured to consistent dimensions, transported in quantity, and laid with mortar into structures of extraordinary solidity and precision. The Ming brick walls were wide enough, the often quoted description goes, for 5 horsemen to ride abreast along the top, or 10 soldiers to march in formation. They were tall, typically between 15 and 30 feet depending on terrain, with a crenellated parapet on the outer face providing cover for defending archers, and a lower inner wall, keeping soldiers from falling off the back. The walkway along the top was paved with more brick, carefully angled to drain rainwater through stone spouts that projected from the outer wall, preventing water from pooling and weakening the mortar below. Every element of this design reflected lessons learned from centuries of defensive experience. The watchtowers, placed every few hundred yards along the wall's length, were not simply lookout posts. They were self-contained military installations, 2 or 3 stories tall, with living quarters for the garrison soldiers on the lower levels, storage for weapons and provisions, and signal beacons on the roof. In the event of a breach or a major attack, soldiers could retreat into their towers and hold out independently while the signal system summoned reinforcements. The towers were the wall's nervous system, and the Ming built them with a care and a quality that reflected their understanding of just how much depended on them functioning correctly. The quality control that went into Ming brick production is one of the more remarkable administrative achievements of the entire project. Bricks were not simply manufactured and delivered anonymously. They were stamped, impressed with the name of the kiln, the supervising official, and sometimes the individual worker who produced them. This was not sentimentality. It was accountability. If a section of wall failed due to substandard brick, the stamps made it possible to trace the defective material back to its source and hold the responsible parties answerable. Archaeologists excavating Ming wall sections have recovered thousands of these stamped bricks, each one a small bureaucratic artifact carrying the name of someone who lived and worked 500 years ago, pressed into clay that has since outlasted them by centuries. The human cost of Ming construction was, as it had been in every previous era of wall building, enormous. The Ming state mobilized soldiers, conscripted laborers, and deployed convict workers across the entire length of the northern frontier, managing a construction effort that continued in various phases of intensity for nearly 200 years. The most active periods of construction came in direct response to military crises, moments when the reality of the northern threat made abstract the question of labor conditions and cost, and focused the Ming administration entirely on the urgent necessity of stone and mortar and height. The most significant of those crises arrived on an October afternoon in 1449 at a place called Tumu Fortress in what is now Hebei province. The Oirat Mongol leader Esen Taishi, having maneuvered brilliantly against a vastly larger Ming force, surrounded and annihilated the imperial army and captured, in the process, the Zhengtong emperor himself. It was the single most humiliating military disaster in Ming history. An emperor of China, taken prisoner by nomads north of the wall, held for ransom like a merchant who had wandered too far from the trade road. The shock that reverberated through the Ming court when news of Tumu reached Beijing was profound and, in its way, transformative. The response was immediate, sustained, and thorough. A new emperor was installed in Beijing, while negotiations for the old one's return proceeded. The military and administrative systems that had allowed the catastrophe were reformed, and the wall that had clearly not been sufficient, not been strong enough, not been extensive enough to prevent what had happened, became the focus of an accelerated, intensified construction program that would continue for the next century and a half with barely a pause. The Ming did not simply repair, they reimagined. They extended the wall east to the sea, where it terminates at Shanhaiguan, the old Dragon's Head, where the wall steps into the Bohai Sea like a great stone creature wading into the waves. They reinforced the mountain passes north of Beijing with overlapping defensive lines of extraordinary complexity. Multiple parallel walls, fortified gates, garrison towns built into the mountain valleys. The whole system designed with the kind of layered redundancy that suggests engineers who had thought very carefully indeed about what would happen if the outermost line failed. They were, in every sense of the word, building for permanence, building for eternity. And what they built in the mountains north of Beijing, the sections at Mutianyu, at Jinshanling, at Simitai, at Badaling, is what survives today as the iconic image of the Great Wall that the entire world recognizes. Those sweeping, undulating ribbons of grey brick riding the mountain ridgelines, their towers catching the morning light, their walls plunging into valleys and climbing again with the effortless confidence of something that belongs exactly where it is. That is the Ming Wall. That is what 2 centuries of obsession and grief and ambition and fired brick produced. It is, by any honest reckoning, one of the supreme architectural achievements of the human species, and it was about to face the test for which it had been built. A wall, however beautifully built, is ultimately a hypothesis. It proposes an answer to a question. Can this line, held by these men, with these stones between them and whatever is coming, be made to hold? And history is the process by which that hypothesis is tested, sometimes brutally, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes in ways that reveal not the wall's weakness but the extraordinary human courage of the people standing on top of it. The Great Wall was tested often, and the story of those tests, of the battles fought along its length, the sieges endured at its gates, the soldiers who lived and died in its towers over the course of 2 centuries of Ming frontier defense, is a story that deserves to be told slowly and with the respect it is owed. Begin with the men themselves, because without them the wall was only stone. The Ming frontier garrison system, at its height, maintained somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million soldiers along the northern border. A figure so large, it is almost difficult to hold in the mind as a human reality rather than a statistic. These men were organized into a network of military districts called Wei and Suo, each responsible for a defined section of the wall and the territory behind it. They were not, for the most part, volunteers in any meaningful sense of the word. Military status in the Ming dynasty was hereditary. If your father was a soldier, you were a soldier, and your son after you would be a soldier, generation after generation, bound to your garrison and your section of wall by a bureaucratic obligation that followed family lines as persistently as a bloodline. A man born into a garrison family in Shanxi in 1450 might reasonably expect that his great-great-grandchildren would still be garrisoning the same stretch of wall in 1550, eating the same inadequate rations, scanning the same northern horizon, sleeping in the same damp towers. Life in the frontier garrisons was, by every account that survives, relentlessly difficult. The rations allocated by the Ming military bureaucracy were theoretically sufficient, but in practice chronically delayed, skimmed by corrupt supply officials, or simply inadequate for the brutal physical demands of frontier service in a northern winter. Soldiers were expected to supplement their provisions by farming the land around their garrisons, a practice that made administrative sense but meant that the men responsible for watching the frontier were also spending significant portions of their time with their backs to it, bent over fields. Their equipment was inconsistently supplied. Their pay, when it arrived at all, was often in goods rather than currency. They lived in the towers and barracks along the wall, in a state of chronic material hardship that their official military status did nothing to alleviate. And yet, they stayed, and when the riders came out of the north, they fought. The tactical reality of defending the wall was more complex than the simple image of soldiers standing behind battlements might suggest. The wall was not, in military terms, a passive barrier. It was an active defensive system, and the soldiers who manned it understood it as such. When Mongol raiding parties approached, the immediate priority was not to stop them at the wall itself. That was often impossible, given the raiders' mobility and their ability to probe for weak points across an enormous frontier, but to slow them, channel them, and signal their approach in time for mobile reserve forces to be concentrated and deployed. The watchtower signal system existed precisely for this purpose, and its speed was one of the most important military assets the Ming possessed on the northern frontier. The defenders of the wall also employed weapons and tactics that reflected centuries of accumulated experience with exactly this kind of threat. Crossbows, powerful, accurate, and requiring less training than the composite bows that Mongol cavalry used, were standard equipment for wall garrisons, allowing even relatively inexperienced soldiers to deliver effective fire from behind the protection of the parapets. Cannons and smaller firearms became increasingly important as the Ming period progressed and Chinese military technology developed. By the late 16th century, firearms were a significant component of the wall's defensive arsenal, a development that substantially changed the tactical calculus for Mongol raiders, considering whether a particular stretch of wall was worth attacking directly. Fire arrows, stones, and boiling water, or oil, were all documented components of the wall's defensive toolkit, deployed from the towers and parapets against attackers attempting to scale the outer face. The battles that were fought along the wall range across an enormous spectrum, from small, sharp engagements at isolated watchtowers to massive, multi-day confrontations at the fortified passes that represented the wall's most strategically critical points. Among the most important of these passes was Juyongguan, the great fortress gate sitting in a narrow mountain valley just north of Beijing, through which any northern force moving on the capital would almost certainly have to pass. Juyongguan had been fortified since the Qin period, but the Ming rebuilt and expanded it into one of the most formidable defensive installations in Asia, a layered complex of walls, gates, and interior fortifications designed to make any attempt to force a passage as costly as possible. The Cloud Terrace, an ornately carved stone arch that survives at Juyongguan to this day, gives some sense of the aesthetic ambition that the Ming brought even to purely military architecture, as if to say that a gate worthy of defending the empire should also be worthy of the empire it defended. The most celebrated and consequential defensive action in the wall's history occurred not at a famous pass, but at a moment of almost theatrical political crisis in the immediate aftermath of the Tumu disaster of 1449. With the Zhengtong Emperor in Mongol captivity and Beijing in a state of barely controlled panic, the Oirat leader Sen Taishi advanced on the capital itself, apparently calculating that the shock of the situation would produce a swift surrender, or at minimum a ransom agreement favorable enough to justify the campaign. What he encountered instead was the newly appointed Minister of War, a man named Yu Qian, who had done something remarkable in the weeks between Tumu and the Mongol arrival at Beijing's walls. Yu Qian had organized a defense. Working with extraordinary speed and administrative competence, he had recalled scattered Ming forces, requisitioned weapons and supplies from the capital's reserves, arranged the city's population into a functioning defensive posture, and, in a move of political boldness that could easily have ended with his execution if it failed, declared that the new emperor, the Jingtai emperor, would remain in Beijing rather than fleeing south, anchoring the capital's morale to the personal presence of the throne. When Essen's forces arrived and found, instead of a city trembling toward capitulation, a fully prepared military defense behind the walls and a court that had clearly decided to fight, the calculation changed. The Mongols probed the defenses for several days, failed to find the weakness they had expected, and withdrew. It was, by any reasonable analysis, one of the most consequential defensive decisions in Chinese history. Yu Qian, who understood perfectly well that a city's greatest vulnerability is the willingness of its defenders to believe it can be held, had made them believe it. He was rewarded for this service some years later, when political winds shifted and his enemies had him executed. History, with more leisure to consider the facts, has been kinder. He is remembered today as one of the great heroes of Ming defense, a man whose combination of administrative genius and personal courage saved Beijing at its most vulnerable moment. The wall's defensive record across the Ming period was not, it must be said, one of unbroken success. The northern frontier was simply too long, and the Mongol and later Jurchen forces too mobile and too tactically sophisticated for any fixed defensive line to hold perfectly under all circumstances. Raiders found gaps. They exploited poorly garrisoned sections. They identified the rhythms of the signal system and probed for moments when coordination between adjacent garrisons broke down. In 50-50, a Mongol leader named Ultan Khan rode entirely around the wall's eastern terminus and struck at Beijing from an unexpected direction, reaching the suburbs of the capital and burning villages within sight of its walls before withdrawing. A humiliation that triggered yet another round of wall reinforcement and garrison reform. But the wall's value was never purely mathematical, never simply a matter of keeping a perfect score of incursions prevented. Its deeper military value lay in what it did to the economics of raiding. A Mongol force that wished to enter the Chinese interior in significant numbers had to either find or make a gap in the wall large enough to pass through, a process that took time, generated signals, and allowed Ming mobile forces to concentrate. The wall turned surprise from a standard tool of steppe warfare into a much more difficult achievement. It transformed the northern frontier from a zone of open vulnerability into something that demanded planning, commitment, and a willingness to absorb casualties even before reaching the agricultural heartland beyond. For raiding parties motivated primarily by the desire to take livestock and grain and return home quickly, these costs were often simply not worth it. The wall did not stop the steppe, but it made the steppe expensive in a way it had not previously been. Among the wall's most celebrated defenders in the late Ming period was the general Qi Jiguang, who was appointed to command the garrison forces in the critical Jizhou sector, the mountain passes north and northeast of Beijing, in 1567, and who spent the following decade transforming what he found there into one of the most effectively organized frontier commands in Ming history. Qi Jiguang was, by any measure, a military thinker of the first order. He understood that the wall's physical structure was only as effective as the men maintaining and defending it, and he found those men in a condition of chronic demoralization, material deprivation, and institutional dysfunction that made their nominal numbers essentially meaningless as a military asset. He changed that with a systematic thoroughness that reads, in historical retrospect, almost like a modern military reformer rather than a 16th century general. He overhauled the training regimen of his garrison forces, introducing standardized drill routines and tactical formations designed specifically for the mixed terrain of mountain passes and open frontier. He reformed the supply system with enough vigor to actually improve rations and equipment availability, no small achievement in the labyrinthine corruption of Ming military logistics. He designed a new type of watchtower, larger and more self-sufficient than the standard Ming design, capable of housing a larger garrison and holding out longer in the event of a serious attack. Dozens of these key design towers were built along the Jizhou sector during his tenure, and they are among the best preserved Ming structures standing today. He also wrote, Qi Jiguang left behind two major military treatises, the Jigshao Xinshu and the Lianbing Shiji, that are recognized as among the most important works of Chinese military theory, practical and detailed documents that drew on his frontier experience to address the real problems of training, organizing, supplying, and leading soldiers in the specific conditions of wall defense. In an era when military writing tended toward philosophical abstraction, Qi Jiguang wrote about the things that actually determined whether men lived or died on the frontier, about unit cohesion and supply chain management, and the psychology of soldiers who had been poorly treated by the institution they served. He is, in the estimation of military historians, one of the finest commanders China ever produced, and the section of wall he reformed and rebuilt is, not coincidentally, the section that survives today in its most magnificent form. And through all of these centuries of defense, through the signal fires and the crossbow volleys, through the desperate holding actions at mountain passes and the long grinding winters in half-supplied towers, the wall accumulated something that transcended its military function. It accumulated meaning. It became, layer by silent layer, the place where China defined itself against everything that was not China, where the empire said, with the only language large enough to say it convincingly, "Here we stand." That meaning, forged in stone and fire and the blood of 10,000 unnamed soldiers, would outlast the dynasty that built it, would outlast, eventually, the very threat it had been built to address. It would outlast almost everything. Almost. Every great human endeavor eventually arrives at the same quiet destination. Not destruction, necessarily. Not even obsolescence, exactly. Something more subtle than either. A transformation from the thing it was built to be into the thing it has become. A crossing of the invisible threshold between instrument and monument, between purpose and meaning. The Great Wall of China crossed that threshold on a spring morning in 1644, though no one marked the moment at the time. Wu Songui, the Ming general commanding the garrison at Shanhaiguan, the great eastern gate where the wall meets the sea, opened his gate to the Manchu forces waiting beyond it, and the last chapter of the wall's life as an active military frontier effectively ended. The Qing dynasty that followed had no use for a wall designed to keep out the very people now running the empire. The garrisons were withdrawn. The signal system went dark. The wall was left, for the second and final time in its history, to the particular mercy of wind and weather and passing centuries. What those centuries did to it was both cruel and, in a strange way, clarifying. In the remote stretches, the desert corridors of Gansu, the open grasslands of Inner Mongolia, the river valleys of Shaanxi, where no tourist road has ever been built, the wall returned quietly to the earth. Brick was taken by local villagers for house construction, a practice so common and so long-standing that entire sections vanished, not through dramatic collapse, but through patient, incremental dismantling, one brick at a time, each one finding its way into a farmhouse wall, or a courtyard boundary, or a village well. Earthen sections slumped and eroded, losing their definition season by season until they became indistinguishable to the untrained eye from the natural ridgelines around them. In some areas, farmers plowed directly through the wall's footprint, incorporating its remains into the agricultural landscape without ceremony or sentiment. This was not vandalism. This was simply the way of things. The wall being reclaimed by the civilization that had built it, its materials returning to the daily life of ordinary people in the way that all things eventually return to what they came from. In the 20th century, the wall's story took another unexpected turn. The founding of the People's Republic in 1949 brought a new government that had, at first, an ambivalent relationship with the imperial monuments of the Chinese past. The wall was enormous, inescapable, and freighted with historical associations that did not map neatly onto revolutionary ideology. During the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s, some sections suffered deliberate damage, another phase of brick removal, this time ideologically motivated rather than practical. Watchtowers were vandalized, inscriptions were defaced, and then, gradually, the calculus changed. Beginning in the 1980s, the Chinese government recognized in the wall something that transcended its complicated political history, a symbol of national continuity so powerful, so immediately recognizable to the entire world, that it constituted a cultural asset of extraordinary value. Restoration projects were launched at the most accessible and photogenic sections. Badaling, north of Beijing, was developed into a tourist destination and received its first significant restoration work in 1957, becoming the section that most visiting heads of state and foreign dignitaries are brought to see. Mutianyu, Jinshanling, Simitai, each received attention, each became in its own way a destination. In 1987, the Great Wall was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The citation described it, with measured understatement, as a monument of outstanding universal value, a structure whose significance transcended any single culture or nation, and belonged, in some meaningful sense, to the human story as a whole. That designation was important, but it did not solve the problem. The problem is scale. The Great Wall is not a single site that can be fenced and monitored and preserved with conventional heritage management tools. It is, in aggregate, an entity of almost incomprehensible size, stretching across 15 provinces and autonomous regions of China, passing through terrain that ranges from easily accessible mountain resort areas to some of the most remote and roadless landscape on the continent. The sections that have been formally restored represent a tiny fraction of the wall's total length. The vast majority of what remains is unrestored and, in many stretches, actively deteriorating. A survey conducted in the early 21st century by the Great Wall of China Society estimated that less than a third of the Ming Wall alone was in good condition, with more than 30% having disappeared entirely and the remainder in varying states of ruin. Erosion is the wall's most relentless enemy. Rain and frost, and the slow chemistry of water working through mortar joints over 5 centuries. But human pressure is a close second. In the popular tourist sections, the volume of foot traffic presents conservation challenges that the Ming engineers could not possibly have anticipated. Millions of visitors walk the wall every year, and the cumulative effect of that passage on 500-year-old brick surfaces is measurable and concerning. In the unrestored sections, a different kind of pressure operates. Agricultural encroachment, construction projects, the continued removal of brick for local building purposes, and an accelerating rate of weathering in sections where the protective lime mortar has failed and water has begun its patient work on the underlying structure. There are people working against all of this. The Great Wall of China Society, founded in 1987, has spent decades documenting, measuring, and advocating for sections of the wall that official preservation efforts have not reached. Volunteer organizations bring teams of workers to remote sections to remove invasive vegetation whose root systems damage the brickwork, to conduct basic mortar repairs, to photograph and record structures before they are lost. Satellite imaging technology has, in recent years, made possible the kind of comprehensive survey of the wall's condition that ground-level inspection alone could never achieve, revealing, in some cases, sections that were not previously known to survive, and in others, confirming the disappearance of sections that were documented only decades ago. It is, by any honest assessment, a race against time. And time, as the wall's entire history demonstrates, is patient in ways that human institutions rarely are. But there is another dimension to the wall's contemporary existence that sits alongside these practical concerns of preservation and tourism management, and it is perhaps the most important dimension of all. It is the experience of standing on it, not at battling on a crowded summer Saturday necessarily, though even there, even with the cable cars and the souvenir stands and the thousands of fellow visitors, the wall has a way of asserting itself, of insisting on its own reality in a manner that cuts through the noise, but ideally at one of the quieter sections. At Jin Shanling in the early morning, when the mist is still in the valleys and the towers emerge from it one by one as the light strengthens. At Simitai in autumn, when the scrub oak on the hillsides has gone rust and gold and the sky above the wall is the particular deep blue that seems reserved for high places and clear days. At some entirely unrestored section in Hebei or Shaanxi, where there is no ticket booth and no other visitor, and the wall is simply there, crumbling, imperfect, ancient, real. In those moments, something happens that is difficult to describe with precision and impossible to replicate through a photograph or a documentary, however carefully made. The wall stops being a historical subject and becomes an experience. The 5 centuries between its builders and yourself collapse, not entirely, but enough that you feel the adjacency of those lives. The mason who laid the brick beneath your feet, the soldier who stood at the parapet above which you are now looking northward, the general who paced this walkway in the grey light of a winter morning, scanning the horizon for smoke signals that might or might not come. You feel, standing there, the full weight of what it means to build something intended to outlast you. The first emperor wanted 10,000 generations. He got more than 80 of them, and the wall he set in motion is still here, still running its ancient line across the body of the continent, still visible, on clear days from certain angles, as a thin grey thread stitching mountain to mountain along the horizon. It was built from fear, and sustained by ambition, and paid for in human suffering on a scale that the historical record can only partially convey. It failed, ultimately, in the specific military purpose for which it was designed. No wall built by human hands has ever permanently held back history, but it succeeded in something larger and stranger and more durable. It became the shape of a civilization's self-understanding, the line China drew around itself in stone and earth, saying, "This is who we are. This is where we stand. This is the border between our world and everything beyond it." That border is porous now, as it always was. The wall no longer divides anything. The steppe to the north is Chinese territory. The nomadic peoples who rode against it for centuries are Chinese citizens. The world the wall was built to exclude has long since become part of the world it was built to protect, and still it stands, not because it was maintained perfectly, or because history was kind to it, all because the civilizations that built it lasted long enough to preserve what they had made. It stands because it was built with a seriousness of purpose that communicated itself into the stone, into the brick, into the compressed earth, and the tamarisk root and the rice mortar that has held mountain walls together through 500 winters. It stands because some things, built with sufficient care and sufficient conviction, simply refuse to entirely disappear. Walk it slowly, if you ever have the chance. There is no hurry. The wall has been here a very long time. It will be here a little longer yet.